I'm the directly elected Mayor of Hackney, so I don't come with a chain if anyone's disappointed about that thing. I'm hoping that I can touch on a few things that will illustrate some of the things that Frances was saying in her contribution. I mean, Hackney's experience of outsourcing, I think, is the story of extremes over the years. Its experience. In the 1990s, it was a hung council for about 5 or 6 years, and there was no leader. It was unique in the country for not having a leader or chairs of committee for about 5 or 6 years, probably unique in local government history. And then the then chief executive ran an experiment of dividing the council up into little autonomous business units, and if they fail, they'll only fail once, won't they? Because then we'll get the private sector in to run them, and that would go from frontline services all the way back to backroom services like HR. And then compare that today, where really we're a borough that's led by an administration that sees outsourcing as a very, very unusual last resort, where every effort is made to take back in-house anything that's still outsourced. But I have to say that that's proved not always possible, even though that we have tried, and I'll touch on that. I mean, I think then and now, often outsourcing is driven by force of circumstances. For example, practical economies of scale around size of management, staff to cover sickness, and equipment to cover niche services, and particularly the inability to recruit in-house management capable of delivering an in-house service, rather than just a simplistic attempt at cost cutting. And certainly the basket case years in Hackney certainly were incredibly difficult years to attract good calibre management that were actually capable of running an in-house service. So often the government departments that were involved in Hackney at the time would press for outsourcing to supposedly improve the service. Obviously it didn't, but that was the only game in town, and actually no one else had a credible alternative based on what on who was willing to actually come and work for the borough. So I've been asked to talk about our experience of services that have been retained or returned in-house, and I think just talking about half a dozen or so quickly, specific service areas in Hackney that have been outsourced at some point. I think I've touched on many of the issues I've been asked to talk about. I mean, revenues and benefits service, that was an abysmal in-house service in the 90s, and that was outsourced in 97 to a company called ITnet. Absolutely no accountability, directors of that company coming to committees at council and lying about the performance, so that when we finally managed to sack them in about 2001, I mean, they're only collecting 65% of the council tax, none of the remainder in the following year. It took them 6 months to put housing benefit payment, housing benefit claim into payment. And then when we finally got through the door of our own building, in the basement, we found 120,000 items of unopened post. But 11 years seems a long time ago when we got rid of them, but it's still talked about by the people of the borough. But it's interesting that they were brought in the 90s because people believed that it was going to bring the smack of firm private sector leadership and introduce IT in what was a painfully paper-based system. But of course it was a huge mistake, because running revenues and benefits, particularly benefits, is a people business. It involves the state in the complex lives of people with difficult personal circumstances. It requires face-to-face contact to resolve those issues, and local knowledge and much more. And actually the government, interestingly in my view, is making exactly the same mistake with the introduction of web-based universal credit. They just think it's a number crunching exercise. And they are going to find out that they are very, very wrong. ICT, specialist service, couldn't get IT people to work for us 10 years ago, outsourced. We managed to recruit a good head of ICT, brings it back in, transfer 30 staff into the council. We've saved around £300,000 just on IT. Recycling, abysmal record the council had 10 years ago, 1% recycling rate. No proper service really was established. It was about 2003, so the council was very much in recovery mode from the dark days, so we had no expertise to be able to do recycling. So it was procured from outside the council, but just after 10 years, we're almost at 10 years point, we're bringing it back in-house. making a saving, improving the service, paying better terms and conditions for staff. I mean, I think I should say it all, really. We'll be integrating it with our waste service, saving almost about £5 million by 2017. We've been running a new pilot of the service in one ward, and recycling performance has increased by 26%, and from where we're already at, and we're pretty much at the London average for inland London. 20% more households recycling every week, and 64% reduction in missed collections of the recycling rounds. Potentially up to 60 staff transferring over to Hackney on those improving terms and conditions, particularly London Living Wage. Well, actually above, because there'll be in-house staff. But you see, interestingly, when it was procured in 2003, it actually went to a social enterprise, Ealing Community Transport Recycling, but they were subsequently bought out, obviously without no control by us, by May Gurney, private company. So it started with a social enterprise, start with private company, which I think is a notable point. So I think it's got echoes of the government's plans for kind of open public services and the community rights challenge, which in my view is more like the community right to trigger competitive tendering that the private sector will probably win. I mean, similarly for the Public Services Social Value Act, I think it's pretty worthless. Private companies like Serco will be far better placed for ticking the right boxes in a procurement process than a charity or a social enterprise for winning those contracts. Leisure centres, again, emergency outsourcing in the late 1990s because the council didn't have the capacity, the money. Went to an absolute execrable private provider who didn't make any improvements. It was dirt cheap, but it was a terrible service. And it was all the council could afford. But when we did have the money, re-tendered it, say still couldn't find the in-house management. But we did go to GLL, Greenwich Leisure, a social enterprise. But even there I've got concerns. They do a fantastic job, they are great, but I've had concerns that I'm beginning to hear reports that some of their people aren't on London Living Wage. They've promised me that they're working on it, but they've got the problem that it's common to social care contracts that people work across borders, and so that's often used as a reason why it's brought up as a difficult issue about paying a London Living Wage to care providers. Cleaning and security. Again, I mean, ahead of the re-procurement of cleaning and the way forward for cleaning and security contracts for council buildings, I've been trying for 18 months to see how we could insource the service. I mean, the best I think I'm going to be able to manage is getting them all on London Living Wage, which will see their wages go up by a third. I've looked at neighbouring borough claims who have actually insourced their cleaning service and saved money, but it turned out that their outsourced private sector contracts were so bloated, even though I'm sure that the staff were only getting a minimum wage, but they were such bloated contracts. Yes, they were able to insource and save money, but the gap between the costs of outsourced on a London Living Wage and direct employment, driven, I have to say, largely by huge increases in costs in national insurance, when that happens, it's going to cost about £500,000 extra between outsourced on a London Living Wage and bringing it in-house. And where we are currently under this government and under the current funding regime, that's going to translate directly to 20 job losses in the council there and then if that was attempted. I mean, we've looked at negotiating phased approach outside of single status. Whereby sort of rises in the London Living Wage, take them on a London Living Wage directly, and then rises in the London Living Wage would erode the differential. But we estimate that that's not going to happen until 2020, and running a two-tier workforce for the next 8 years is something that I think looks somewhat dubious. I mean, interestingly, the longer the freeze of pay settlements goes on and the continued increase in London Living Wage, actually the sooner there will be that financial disincentive for councils to employ staff, but I'm not standing here as an advocate for a continued wage freeze for the lowest paid staff in the public sector. But it is a huge problem that that, as I say, I spent 18 months trying to overcome, and I'm still not there. We'll also look at all sorts of innovative ways to bring services in-house and make them viable. Education services, we were forced by the Labour government, actually, by a legal direction, to contract for education services in 2002. And we managed to win the fight that it shouldn't go to a private contractor. And so, so the Learning Trust was created, which was a not-for-profit organisation with exactly the same staff. You know, even the chief executive would have been our director of children's services, and for the last 5 years of the contract, he has been our director of children's services. So the kind of Chinese walls that were built have been crumbling constantly over that decade. So the 10-year contract ended this July, but of course this comes at a time when the government is sort of effectively making moves in various ways to stop local authorities running support services for schools in all sorts of ways. So anyway, we've taken all the staff back, TUC'd them back, and as other councils are withdrawing from school improvement because of having so many academies and free schools, we're looking to also offer our services to them, so the public sector will be able to continue providing direct school, school improvement services to local authorities in London. So we created this Hackney Learning Trust to do that, keeping the brand and the operation going that our schools want. Because actually, I think the first thing I did when it came back into council control was change the logo and said, right, we the council are in charge now. I think the schools would have started looking to see what the alternatives were for school support. So I say we've done that not to prepare it for some sort of Francis Maud flotation. Quite the opposite, and it involves really a 3-year experiment to see if this kind of devolved freedoms and flexibilities for staff to kind of mimic a social enterprise actually gains the benefits that Francis Maud thinks that there are in such an operation, but they will be wholly council staff on council terms and conditions in every single way, completely. You couldn't differentiate between them and any other council staff in that sense. Waste services. That was outsourced in 2001 for 18 months while single status was being negotiated. I don't think the council would have got through single status if we'd have had an in-house workforce at the time. And again, it was a terrible in-house service. Absolutely the worst in the country and the most expensive in the country. And actually outsourcing it just meant it was the most expensive, outsourced, worst waste service in the country. It just didn't improve on quality or cost. But and at the time, union negotiations were, they would turn up with one of them in Crombie dark glasses and holding a baseball bat. So things weren't going well. But I'd like to just, if I may, I know I'm probably going a bit of time, I'd just like to share this with you, these words. This is about the waste service. We've worked well, the unions, management, unions and GMB Unite, to develop services and improve performance. Unions in Hackney have acted responsibly and worked with everyone to develop services. In real terms, we've saved around £2 million annually when you compare the service provided today with the cost of the service provided by the private sector in 2000. Included in that is the fact that we're delivering more services for less cost and at a higher standard. For example, we have moved from being one of the dirtiest boroughs to one of the cleanest in London. This has been done whilst providing good terms and conditions generally for the workforce. You only have to look at the pay of our manual workers compared to that of the private sector for the same work. Our staff enjoy far better pay, sickness and pension benefits, and yet the service costs less in real terms than it did in 2000. Our experience is that performance improves through insourcing services. Look at the performance on both cleansing, refuse collection and graffiti. In-house services can be competitive, both financially and performance-wise, through a mix of greater ownership and accountability. An example of the reduction of 8 rounds from the previous bin rounds from the previous private contract and improving areas such as miscollections, and this against a backdrop of an increasing population because of all the developments that have gone on now. My experience of in-source services that those on the first rung of the ladder, manual workers, have more opportunity to progress within the organisation. The training we provide and opportunities that are made available to all staff are way ahead of those in the private sector for staff at that level. That's got literacy and numeracy courses that we run for people pushing the brooms. My experience with the private sector is that the benefits and opportunities go to the more senior staff, and getting on often depends on who you know rather than potential or ability. A well-run DSO can deliver far better services for its residents than any private sector company can. We're far more in touch with the residents, and businesses and services can be adapted far easier. We're not tied into the same sort of contractual arrangement that councils get into with the private sector. Basically, unless you get the contract with the private sector exactly right at the start, it costs more money whenever you try to vary that. I could go on and on because I've got a little bit more on that, but I'm running short of time. That's not the union convener in Hackney. That's one of the management. That's the waste services manager who is writing that, and I can absolutely endorse every single word of that. I mean, to wrap up, finally, as I could go on all sorts of things, but I mean, essentially, I think what's key here is quality of service, for instance, as a borough leader, quality of services, that those services are affordable and cost effective. And thirdly, that the terms and conditions for the workforce are fair. And I just think that in-house delivery is absolutely best placed to deliver on all those three at the same time. I have yet to see a good example where that, of an authority where those three things can be consistently delivered with an outsourcing agenda. Thanks very much.